In the late 80s, when I was still at school, we had this school cafeteria that served really abysmal food. And I know, kids always complain about school food, right? But trust me when I say it truly was atrocious. So me and my mates went to this nearby cafe instead. And the great thing about this place, apart from having edible food, was that it had a sitting area where they had 2 arcade machines and a pinball game. The first time we went there, they had a Ghosts and Goblins machine, and I was instantly hooked on it, and it quickly became one of my absolute favorite arcade games ever. It was just something about the gorgeous graphics, the extremely catchy music, and that just one more go gameplay that drew me in. I went to the cafe pretty much every school day and every recess, and fed the Ghosts and Goblins machine with coins and myself with bread and cheese. I slowly got better at the game and eventually could pretty reliably reach stage 5 with just 1 credit. And that's how we played back then. We got 1 credit, and when it was game over, you had to relinquish the controls to the next player. Sadly, one day the cabinet was gone and replaced with Bomb Jack, I believe, which is another one of my favorites, but that's a different story. So I never managed to figure out how to defeat the stage 5 boss, sadly. Ghosts and Goblins was developed by Capcom and released in Japan on September 19, 1985, and has since seen many conversions and a fair amount of sequels and spin-offs. According to the Wikipedia, it's the 8th best-selling Capcom game franchise. The original Japanese name is Makaimura, which roughly translates to Demon World Village or Hell Village. Interestingly enough, on some flyers the game is called Ghost and Goblins instead of Ghosts and Goblins. You can also see this on the box art on some of the early home conversions. The game was distributed and manufactured in the US by Taito and Romstar. Not sure who handled this in Europe, but the cabinet I played back in the day was just a generic one. Here's a closer look at the side art of the Taito version. It's not really a favorite of mine, but it does have a certain silly charm. But I don't think the artist ever got to play the game or even got to see it. I can kind of recognize the first boss on the left side, but the other monsters look like they're from a completely different game. Also note the cigar-smoking vulture on the lower left and the weird alien to the right. Here's a look at the Romstar marquee. I really like this one, and the artist seems to have actually gotten to at least see the game in action. I've been unable to find the Romstar bezel though. Maybe there wasn't one? Not entirely sure. The game also saw a fair amount of bootleg releases, with usually pretty shoddy artwork. Except this marquee, which is really nice. No idea who made it or where it's from, but I'm pretty sure it's a bootleg. The hero of the game is a knight called Arthur, but he is referred to as Sir Michael in the instructions on the Taito release. Probably because they didn't translate the Japanese material and just wrote their own story. Arthur has shown up in many different Capcom games over the years, most recently in Street Fighter V. The princess in dire need of rescuing in the game is called Princess Prin, sometimes also known as Guinevere, the ruler of the unnamed lands where the game takes place. She has also appeared in other games in the franchise, as well as a Street Fighter RPG card game. Interestingly enough, there was also several board games based on Ghosts and Goblins. The most well known is probably the Big Bandai version released in 1986. It has some amazing artwork, which is a lot creepier than the artwork for the arcade game. Bandai also released a much smaller board game the same year, where you got a Famicom-shaped case to put the game in, or if you wanted, your actual Makaimura Famicom cartridge. Hanayama also released a Ghosts and Goblins board game, not exactly sure when. It's apparently quite rare and a lot simpler than Bandai's games. Some of its artwork seems like it's been lifted from the actual Famicom game. Sadly, all of these were only released in Japan and fetches rather hefty prices on eBay these days. There's also supposed to be others, including a Korean one that mashes up several of the early games in the franchise. A huge thank you to Nathan Altis for providing me with this information and also the amazing photos. Ghosts and Goblins the arcade game is a raster game running at a resolution of 256 x 224 pixels at 59.59 Hz. It has a Motorola MC6809 at 1.5 MHz as its main CPU and a Silex Z80 at 3 MHz as its audio CPU. It uses two Yamaha YM2203 OPN sound chips at 1.5 MHz each to handle music and effects in mono. You control the game with an 8-way joystick and two buttons, one for firing and one for jumping. The game has 4 difficulty levels: easy, normal, difficult and very difficult. And I can thoroughly recommend easy or normal, unless of course you're a masochist. You can also control how many lives you start with: 3, 4, 5 or 7. The game starts out with our hero Arthur hanging out with his girlfriend Princess Prin in the cemetery, wearing nothing but his underpants. But before he gets a chance to play hide the dagger, a demon shows up and kidnaps the princess. So nothing else to do but to don your armor and go after her. Arthur is now faced with 6 stages to conquer, 7 if you include the final boss stage, which is really just a single room with the boss in it. The enemies comes in all kinds of demonic shapes and sizes. To defend himself, Arthur is equipped with a never-ending supply of lances that he can throw at the enemies. Where he stores these weapons is a bit of a mystery, to be honest, possibly in his infinite underpants. There's also 4 additional weapons for you to pick up via pots that your enemies drop. Here's a look at the weapons. The sword, most players prefer this one, faster than the lance. The torch fires a burning torch in a downwards arc and sets fire to the ground where it lands. Any enemies walking into the fire will be damaged. Pretty inconvenient and best stayed away from. Much foul language has been used when picking this one up by mistake. The axe works a bit like the torch but goes through enemies, potentially killing multiple targets. Definitely better than the torch, but still a bit tricky to use and best avoided. It also seems to be a somewhat rare drop. The shield, or a crucifix in the Japanese version, got a very short range, but it's fast and also stops most enemy projectiles. It's a weapon that needs some getting used to, and is also the only weapon that can kill the final boss. Should you enter the final stage without the shield, the game will tell you that your weapon has no effect and sends you back to the beginning of stage 5. If Arthur gets hit by an enemy, his armor flies off and he continues to fight in his underpants. A sight that really should strike fear into most demons. Should he get hit again, he will thankfully not lose his underpants, but instead he is transformed into a pile of bones and you lose a life. It is possible to find new armors if you jump at specific locations in the game. The game will also award you extra lives at certain point intervals, depending on how it's set up. The game is notorious for being difficult. The director of the game, Takuro Fujiwara, is apparently quite fond of making difficult games. But of course most arcade games back then were designed to be difficult, to be able to eat more of your hard-earned coins. So I suppose it's debatable if Ghosts and Goblins is that much harder than your average 80s arcade game. But let's just say, it's not an easy game. As with many arcade games, if you time your moves and attacks the same each game, it gets a lot more manageable. But mistiming your moves will often affect enemy behavior and make them unpredictable. And then you're in a world of pain. But the game rarely feels unfair and you slowly learn how to tackle the different enemies as your pile of coins rapidly disappear. The biggest frustration for me is that you can't control Arthur while jumping. You can turn around while in mid-air, but the length of the jump remains the same. This can often lead to you landing on top of an enemy that wasn't there when you pressed the jump button. One of the things that drew me into the game was the sense of exploration. I loved pushing forward and discovering new stages and enemies, much thanks to the atmospheric graphics, which looked amazing for their time. I still think they look good, but of course they do look their best on a CRT monitor, so what you see in this video might not exactly convey how the game looked back then. The first 3 stages are definitely the most interesting though. After that the environments gets a little bit less varied and there's also a lot of reused enemies. The music in the game is extremely catchy and is truly a classic piece in gaming history. Once it has managed to infest your brain, it's hard not to find yourself humming away at it without even realizing it. The game uses synthesized music and sound effects only, no samples. Personally, I'm very fond of the distinct sound effects and still find them most satisfying. Although some may argue that they are very 80s sounding, and they're not wrong, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Let's have a look at the enemies in the game and what they are up to. Zombies are the first enemies you encounter in the game. They dig themselves out of the ground and march towards you. Should they survive encountering you, they will burrow back into the ground. The green monster is just a big, misunderstood man-eating plant that sometimes barks a projectile at you, which by Ghosts and Goblins standards would almost be considered polite. Shoot a gravestone or a rock 15 times and the magician shows up. He doesn't do children's parties, but he does try and turn Arthur into a frog. Thankfully the effect wears off after a few seconds. Crows likes to hang out on gravestones, windowsills and sometimes local bars. Well, the bars bit might be a lie, but there's two different types of crows. The blue crows that flies in a straight line towards you, and the slightly sneakier red crows that flies diagonally. This is the infamous Red Arima, one of the most hated arcade enemies of all times. Gamers hated him so much that Capcom had him star in several other games, including Demon's Crest on the SNES. Sadly, this hasn't improved his demeanor and he's still an absolute bastard. He presents no problem if you can kill him while he's still on the ground, but should he get airborne, you have problems. Should you manage with the feat of staying alive for 60 seconds or more while this menace is dive bombing you, he will turn white and become an even bigger bastard. And yes, I'm using a cheat here. The Flying Knights can only be found in the forest on stage 1. They move in a rather annoying wave-like pattern and must be shot in the back to be killed. The Woody Pigs fly around armed with a spear that they either throw forward or straight down. The movement patterns are rather difficult to predict and they can turn around very quickly. The Unicorn is the first boss in the game and probably my favorite one visually. He's not too hard to defeat, but he has some surprises up his sleeve. Like his fondness for jumping over Arthur's head, also quite likes to charge you at inconvenient times. The Blue Killer is first introduced in the Ice Palace on stage 2. As long as you keep moving, they usually don't present too much of a problem, but if you decide to hang around, things go downhill quickly. Petite Devils are fairly rare, but still an absolute and utter pain. Best to just keep running and not get bogged down fighting them. Big men randomly march back and forth horizontally until you are at their level. When you get close enough, they will either rush you or start chucking projectiles at you. When underneath them, they can also drop a projectile down. And they can also be an incredible pain to deal with when you're trying to climb down to their level. That's when I hate them the most. Bats are fairly rare and most of the time don't present much of a problem at all. Just try not to jump when they are around, since they do love to fly around just above head level. The Tower Monster can only be found on stage 3 and don't present much of a problem, as long as you kill them quickly. The Dragon is the second boss of the game, quite a tricky critter to deal with, loves swooping around in hard to predict patterns, and each of the body parts needs to be destroyed, or you can just destroy the head to kill it quickly. I remember it was possible to kill it instantly by hitting the head with 6 fast shots before it took off, but it's pretty tricky to pull off. The skeleton starts out like a skull peacefully resting on the floor, but the moment you get near it, it will leap up and start jumping around like a mental kangaroo. It's best killed off while still in skull form. You thought the Red Arima was a pain? Well, meet his daddy, Satan. When he holds up his cape, you can't hurt him, but the moment he reveals himself, he comes swooping down in your face, making it a bit tricky hitting him. And the fun really gets going at the end of stage 6, when you have to fight 2 of them at the same time. Unless you lure them out one at a time, of course. Time to meet Astaroth, the final boss of the game. He can only be killed by the shield or the crucifix in the Japanese version, and you need to hit them in the chest to damage him. He is surprisingly easy considering that he is the final boss of the game. Of course, when you defeat him the first time, the game informs you that all of this has been an illusion, and you need to start from the beginning again, only this time it's even harder. Yes, it's true, Ghosts and Goblins hates you. If you finish the game a second time, you will get the true ending. The game was designed and directed by Tokuro Fujiwara. Some sources also incorrectly credit Shinichi Yoshimoto and Hisashi Yamamoto in collaboration with Fujiwara, but they only worked with him on the sequel, Ghouls and Ghosts. Fujiwara-san began his career at Konami in '82, where he directed Puyan and Rock'n'Roll. He left Konami in '83 and started working for Capcom, where he is known for directing Ghosts and Goblins, Commando, Bionic Commando, Strider, Ghouls and Ghosts, and others. He also produced Resident Evil 1 and several of the Mega Man games. He left Capcom in '96, and in '97 he established his own company, Whoopee Camp, located in Mino in the Osaka prefecture. Here he directed the two platformers Toombi 1 and 2, also known as Toomba. The Toombi games were critically well received, but sales were poor, partly due to poor distribution, and shortly after Toombi 2 was released in 1999, Whoopee Camp went out of business. In May 1988 he was involved in starting the company Deep Space, which was an affiliate to Whoopee Camp. Some sources suggest that Deep Space was a joint venture with Sony Computer Entertainment International, but I haven't been able to confirm this. The office of Deep Space was located in the same building as Whoopee Camp, but on a different floor. At Deep Space he was the executive director for Extermination and Hungry Ghosts. In 2003, after Hungry Ghosts was released, Deep Space was also shut down, as far as I can tell. According to IGN, he went back to Capcom in 2006 to direct and plan Ultimate Ghosts and Goblins for the PSP. After that, some sources on the web claimed that he obtained a permanent position at Platinum Games in 2008, but that has been denied in a tweet by Hideki Kamiya as of March 2012. However, Fujiwara-san did work as a designer on the Platinum game Mad World, but after 2008 I have no idea what he's been up to. The coding was done by Toshio Arima and very little is known about him. He is sometimes mistakenly credited as the designer of the game. Just like Fujiwara-san, he seems to have started his career at Konami in 1982, where he coded Time Pilot and Gyruss. He left Konami together with Yoshiki Okamoto and they both went over to Capcom, where he worked together with Fujiwara-san on Pirate Ship Higemaru and Commando. The main reason for us knowing about his work seems to be because he left hidden messages in the game code. You can find the following message hidden in one of the ROMs in Ghosts and Goblins and Section Z. There's also similar messages hidden in Time Pilot and Gyruss. In an interview, Takura Fujiwara confirms that the Red Arima enemy is named after Arima-san. He also suggests that there was a certain resemblance between the two. Now, one would imagine that it wouldn't be particularly hard to track down a person that looks like a pointy-eared demon with a red complexion, but after Arima-san finished Section Z for Capcom in 1985, he seems to have fallen off the face of the earth. At least as far as the internet is concerned. If Arima-san is a mystery, then the graphics designer is an even bigger one. Most sources credit a Masayoshi Kurokawa, but I've been unable to find any information about him. When I reached out to Harumi Fujita, the sound effects designer, and asked her about Kurokawa-san, she didn't recognize the name and sent me a different one, Shinkei Kurokawa. Sadly, she didn't have any further information about him or indeed Arima-san. But she told me something rather interesting. At the time, Capcom didn't always use the correct name to credit the creators of a game, apparently to try and prevent other companies from headhunting their employees. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any information about Shinkei Kurokawa either. For a while I suspected that the person behind the graphics could be Masahiko Kurokawa, also known as Patario. He also worked at Capcom in the early 80s and collaborated with Fujiwara-san on several games, but according to Harumi-san, he joined Capcom after development of Ghosts and Goblins had already started. So I am at a loss here. If anyone know anything about the graphics designer or indeed the coder, please drop me a comment. Ayako Mori composed the music in the game, and she was one of the first composers Capcom ever employed. She began her career there in 1984 and left the company in '86. According to Harumi Fujita, the reason for her leaving was that she was getting married. Very little is known about what she's been up to since, but according to the Capcom database, she was hired by Sony Music Communications as an art coordinator for soundtrack releases of some Capcom titles, like Resident Evil 2 and Street Fighter Alpha 3. She is probably best known for her work on Ghosts and Goblins, but she also worked on the classic 1942. It also seems that she worked on both the arcade and NES versions of the music for most of the games she was involved with. The sound effects designer Harumi Fujita is sometimes mistakenly credited for composing the music, but she only worked on the sound effects. According to Harumi-san, she created the sound effects using a program made by the coder Arima-san, and it took about 3 months to finish. Her favorite sound effects are the sound that the woody pigs make and the sound when you lose a life. Fujita-san graduated from Osaka College of General Design in 1984. She then got an interview with SNK for a designer position, but when they saw the words music composer on her resume, they immediately hired her to do that instead, since they didn't have a composer. Her first project was creating the sound and music for the arcade game Mad Crasher. She ended up using a toy musical keyboard when composing, since SNK didn't have any real keyboards. In 1985 she started working for Capcom, where her first task was creating the sound effects for Ghosts and Goblins. Other than that, she's most known for composing the music for Bionic Commando the arcade, Strider on the NES and Mega Man 3 on the NES, which she only worked on 3 tracks, before she had to abandon the project due to maternal labor. Her colleague Yasuaki Fujita took over and finished the project. Then there's of course Gargoyle's Quest on the Game Boy, Polestar and Blazing Star on the Neo Geo, and she also worked with Fujiwara-san on Tumbi at Whoopee Camp. Around 2000 she took a hiatus from the game industry and started working with stage music. She is currently working as a freelance composer, but when I asked her, she said that she wanted to get back into game music. Some of the glitches mentioned here have been fixed in later revisions of the game. Want to amass lots of points and get some extra lives? Go to stage 3, stand roughly underneath the middle stalactite as seen on the screen, and quickly waggle the stick left and right while firing. If done correctly, there will be a ton of zombies spawning around you that you can kill for lots of points. Don't feel like fighting the second dragon boss? Just turn around and run the other way the moment you hear the boss music. After a bit the music should stop and the dragon should be gone. You can do something similar to the Satan boss at the end of stage 5, but it's harder to pull off. Aggro the boss and then quickly run back the way you came. Try and use the hole in the floor to drop down faster. If you manage to time it right and miss all the platforms, the music should stop and the boss will be gone. I messed up the timing here, but still got lucky and managed to pull it off. Want to mess with and potentially get rid of the unicorn mini-bosses at the start of stage 5? Stand either to the extreme left or right on the level below the unicorns, and when they are directly above you, fire. This often forces the unicorn to jump. Now a couple of things can happen. Either the boss falls down to your level, glitch out and get stuck in mid-air, or sometimes just disappear. Note that there might only be one unicorn here in some revisions of the game. If the game's difficulty is set to below hard, you can traverse the entire fire bridge without being pestered by the blue devils, but just keep going right without stopping. Sadly, you will still have to deal with the red Arima though. It is possible to jump through the walls on stage 5 and 6 on some spots and get killed or get stuck. This can apparently be used to your advantage in the boss fight on stage 6, but I couldn't get it to work. Get turned into a frog on stage 1 and then drown yourself. If you then get turned into a frog again on the next life, you will briefly become a black frog. Try and get killed by the timer reaching 0 at the same moment as the magician's spell hits you. It's pretty hard to pull off, and if you like me manage to mess up the timing a tiny bit, Arthur's sprite will be completely broken. But if done correctly, the sprite will be normal and you will have a lot more time to finish the current stage. If you fancy breaking the game, don't go beyond the tree to the right of the last tombstone on stage 1. Go back till the screen stops scrolling. Climb down the ladder to the left, and boom, game broken. You need to let the timer reach 0 to unbreak the game. There's been a ton of Ghosts and Goblins conversions over the years, the most recent one being the iOS version, released in 2017, but I'm going to focus on the early conversions here. The Amiga version is probably the best of the early home conversions. The graphics are really faithful to the arcade, so is sound and music, even though some of it is missing. All of the original stages are included and they even managed to nail the enemy behavior pretty well. Scrolling is mostly smooth, although sometimes when moving vertically it gets really jerky. There's also some significant slowdown at certain points. Sadly, you can't fire backwards while jumping. The game will also sometimes quite happily spawn enemies on top of you or put you in situations where continuously spawning enemies will prevent any progress. You also need a 1 meg machine to run it. So some more fine-tuning and this one could have been really great. Here's the Amstrad CPC version, and let's just start off by saying it's not great. On the plus side, it has music by David Whittaker, but that's about it. They removed the bit where Arthur loses his armor when getting hit. Instead, you just lose a life and have to restart. Very frustrating. The jerky flip scrolling and dodgy hit detection also makes its best to frustrate the player. The graphics are blocky and the sprites has very limited color. The artist Steve Pickford, who also worked on other conversions of Ghosts and Goblins, mentions on his homepage how frustrated he was when the coders limited the amount of colors he had to work with on the sprites. Also, there's only 3 stages and the game restarts after killing the dragon boss. This one is best forgotten. I was really excited when I heard that they were releasing Ghosts and Goblins for my humble Atari ST. Sadly, I was rather disappointed when I finally got to play it. But let's start off with the good stuff. Mark Cooks' music is a nice rendition of the original, and Steve Pickford's graphics, while quite different compared to the arcade version, looks nice. But the game runs too fast and feels loose and twitchy. Enemies will happily spawn way too close to you and with such speed that there is no way of avoiding them. That combined with an abominable hit detection makes the game frustratingly hard. And no, you can't fire backwards while jumping here either. The game also abruptly ends after fighting the dragon boss at the end of stage 4. This one could have used a lot more love. Graphics designer Steve Pickford had this to say about development, and I quote, "The ST version was a project that dragged on for years and years, like a kind of living nightmare." The Commodore 64 version is probably the best of the 8-bit computer versions. Graphics are blocky but colorful and scroll smoothly. Music is well done, although not based on the arcade music. Sadly, only 4 stages are included, and the game ends after fighting the dragon boss. Also, the hit detection is pretty wonky at times, but otherwise a decent conversion. Oh god, my poor eyes and ears. What is this thing? Well, it's the Commodore Plus 4 and the Commodore 16 version. And let's just face it, it's awful. Minimal and annoying sound effects, non-existent sprite masking, atrocious hit detection, and just plain terrible and overly difficult gameplay. Oh, and the graphics aren't great either. Thankfully, it only has the 2 first stages, so that should reduce the pain somewhat should you attempt the folly of trying to finish it. This is easily the worst of the early home conversions, and is better off forgotten and put back under the rock whence it crawled back in 1986. Here comes another train wreck, the MS-DOS version. Now, the PC wasn't exactly renowned for its games back in 1987, and this conversion is probably one of the reasons why. Seems like it has all the stages, more or less, but that is not necessarily a good thing. The screen doesn't scroll, but instead it's using a flip screen, and enemies have a peculiar habit of just spawning in out of nowhere. At least you have the ability to fire backwards while jumping in this one, and also move Arthur while in the air. But controlling him feels like trying to control a demented seagull at a landfill. Now, I would still consider this one being better than the C16 Plus 4 version, but not by much. Mainly because it's less difficult and you can also cheat yourself to the next screen by simply pressing the right cursor key. Now let's move on before the PC speaker music destroys what is left of my sanity. Time for the infamous NES version, which I think might be harder than the arcade original. Still, it's a pretty faithful and fun conversion, but they are pushing the poor old NES pretty hard, so there are quite a few graphical glitches and flickering at times. Otherwise, the graphics are as good as you could hope for and feels like a decent representation of the arcade original. Music and sound effects are respectable, but also a bit annoying. The effect keeps interrupting the music, and sometimes the NES sounds like it's in some sort of pain with all the squeaking and beeping going on. The Game Boy Color version is rather solid and is a pixel-exact port of the NES version, but with much improved music and sound effects. It also thankfully runs better than the NES version, with less flickering and graphical glitches. Difficulty is supposed to be at the same level as its predecessor, but it feels maybe a bit easier. All stages are included and are fairly faithful to the original. The play area is a bit small and the platforming is also a tad iffy at places, but not too much else to complain about really. There's also an early beta of an arcade-perfect port for the Game Boy Advance. It was a homebrew project by Frank Vandestad, which as far as I know was never finished. I know what you're thinking. This looks pants. And yes, the ZX Spectrum version isn't pretty to behold, and the farty sound effects doesn't make it much better. But it's not a bad conversion all things considered. It plays fairly well and it even scrolls pretty smoothly, which is quite impressive for a Spectrum. Only 3 stages are included, and sadly, it's also hideously difficult at times, with unfair enemy spawning and dodgy hit detection. So it could definitely have benefited from some more work, but not too bad all things considered. I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and if you did, please consider supporting me on Patreon. There's a link in the description. As little as $1 a month would be much appreciated and will also help me to produce more of these in-depth videos. So thanks for watching and hope to catch you in the next video. Cheers!